Having moved from Crimea to Kiev, I used to ask my friends about their memories from the times when they were kids and teens. I asked about culture, education, their relationship with parents, comparing our experiences. One day, I asked my friend who was studying in a school in Kiev how they celebrated the holiday of Friendship of Nations in his school. "What holiday?" he asked, as if not hearing properly. "The holiday of Friendship of Nations," I replied, surprised by his reaction. "We never had that. What kind of holiday is it?" I started to explain. "It's when you and your classmates dress up in national costumes, share the history of your family, dance to national music, and taste traditional dishes." So far it sounds normal, right? But I asked my friend this question wanting to find out if he also felt something strange and wrong about this holiday, or if it was just me having these weird feelings of the incongruity of this holiday and rotten aftertaste that followed. When it turned out that such a holiday simply didn't exist in Kiev, I understood why it was only in Crimea. To instill in children's minds from an early age that in Crimea all nations are equal, that we all live in friendship, and that Crimea has always been multinational. Damn, this is straight out of the Soviet playbook. Forcing us to learn and declamate poetry about how Russians and Crimean Tatars have always been and will be forever friends in historically equal rules of this land, they ingrained in us Russian myths. For instance, myth about the absence of indigenous peoples in Crimea, or that Crimea has always been Russian, because how could it be otherwise if Crimea is common? It belongs to everyone who lives here. History was twisted so that Russians in Crimea would fill in their place, while Crimean Tatars became a diminishing minority. And what's both funny and sad at the same time, as I was preparing to this episode, I googled about this school event. Do you know in which country the holiday of Friendship of Nations is a must-have in educational institutions? In Russia, where there are already plenty of people living all those territories longer than Russia has existed as a state, who have already disappeared or are on the brink of disappearance. Just like in the Soviet Union, it seems like all nations are equal, but one is more equal than others.
If you can't recognize this voice, it's because you haven't heard it before on our podcast. This is the voice of a young Crimean Tatar woman named Lina, because there can be no podcast about Ukraine without an episode on Qırım, or as it is now known, Crimea. So we asked her to join us for this special episode on the place she calls home and hopes to return to one day when it's finally freed from Russian occupation. This is a special season of Ukrainian Spaces, a podcast elevating diverse Ukrainian voices and explaining Ukraine to the world. For many of us who grew up in Ukraine that had once again regained its independence, Crimea will always hold a special place in our hearts. For me personally, it was a place I remember going to for almost every summer holiday with my parents, cousins, grandmother, sometimes friends. My dad used to say that it had a special microclimate, one that could only be compared to that in the south of France, with the sea, mountains, and pine trees. From Kyiv, you could drive there by car or take a long overnight train that would stop in all the places in the south of Ukraine that we now read about in the news, like Kherson. But during every visit, my parents would always tell me about the indigenous people of Qırım, the Crimean Tatars. I would always be curious, but not curious enough to learn more about their tragic fate. My adolescent ignorance prevented me from understanding more about those who were so intrinsically intertwined with these lands, and those who Russia tried so virulently to erase. When Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014, it acquired a new meaning for us and the world. These tragic events signified the fact that Russia would stop at absolutely nothing. But what did Crimea mean for those indigenous to it? We invited Lina, a young Crimean Tatar YouTuber who has been tirelessly working to dispel Russian propaganda about her home, for a conversation. Because no matter how much we can tell you about Crimea, Qırım, can only authentically be told through the memories of those it truly belongs to. Thank you for joining us, Lina, on a Sunday in the evening. We won't keep you long, but we can't do our podcast about Ukraine without doing an episode on Crimea. And so we wanted to invite you to speak to us and to talk with us about your home and about its history and about your identity and how you understand now your identity and whether that has changed for you at all. And before this episode, I was talking to Maksym about this, and he said that Crimea is basically a shortcut to understanding how Russian colonialism works. And so we are really grateful that you're joining us today to talk to us. When we did these episodes before for our previous 3 seasons, we always started with one question, which is we always asked our guests to introduce themselves to those listening. So we wanted to ask you, Lina, if you could please tell us a little bit about yourself and about your work that you're doing now. You obviously have an incredibly popular YouTube channel, and we wanted to ask you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Firstly, thank you guys for having me here. I believe it's like the most important part of my life right now, the Crimea, they're talking about Crimea, because as you mentioned, I have a crucial question of identity. So yeah, I'm Lina from Crimea. I'm from Ukrainian Crimean Tatar family. My mom is Crimean Tatar, and actually only in age of, I believe, 23, 24, I realized that I am Crimean Tatar, because the previous years of my life, I was kind of not ashamed, but, not proud of it, because we had such narratives coming from Russian colonialism and its policy towards Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars and generally everyone who is not Russian. So yeah, it was kind of tough thing for me, but now I'm proud to say that I'm Crimean Tatar, and I'm trying to share the history of me, of my family, of the whole our nation to English-speaking people in the whole world, because I believe it's kind of underrated thing today, especially in 2024, talking about it like Russia is the enemy of the whole democratic world today. Yeah, I'm trying to tell the history through my YouTube channel. I'd say also in Twitter, I'm trying to write some memories about Crimea, because I believe we share our histories the best way through our memories, through our stories, through our families. Also, I'm working right now in Ukrainian Crimean Tatar literature project, which is called Crimean FIG, Qırım İnciri in Crimean Tatar language. Yeah, we are trying to develop Ukrainian Crimean Tatars translates and like poetry and fiction.
Lina, if I can ask you right away on the basics, because you mentioned the name of your project. So we were wondering if you can also a little bit educate the rest of the our audience about the terminology and interchangeable names for Crimea that we often use. On this podcast, many other Crimean Tatars or Kremli use the two names Crimea, Qırım interchangeably. And there are a lot of interesting now conversations why the return of the Qırım name is so important, especially now. So can you explain the rest of the audience? Is it important for you? And what is the difference when people say Crimean Tatars or Crimea versus Qırım and Kremli?
I'd say it is important to call Crimean Tatars by this name, not just Crimeans and actually Ukrainians. Despite the fact that Crimea is Ukraine, we have to highlight that we, Ukraine, a political nation, we also have a nation called Crimean Tatars, who are not just like some guys living on our territory. Crimean Tatars is kind of old nation. Crimean Tatars are indigenous people of Crimea. there are three of us, Crimean Tatars, Krimchaks, and Karaites. And unfortunately, due to Russian colonial politic and imperialism, the Krimchaks and Karaites, they're under 5,000 people, both nation, I mean. Crimean Tatars have a larger number of its population. So Crimean Tatars are the indigenous people of Crimea, of Ukraine. We have no other homeland than Crimea. So that's why it's important for us to fight for it. And we do it, like in the Ukrainian forces. We are protecting our land and the whole Ukraine from Russia today. Crimean Tatars had their own state, the Crimean Khanate, for almost 350 years. And it was a center of Islamic development in the whole Europe. It was a modern state where there were no such big problems as Russian propaganda tries to describe. They're telling that Crimean Tatars were bandits, terrorists, murderers, like savages. And that is Russian lies about everyone who isn't Russian. Also, Crimean Tatars created the world's first Islamic Democratic Republic. It was the Crimean Democratic Republic in the beginning of 20th century. And it was a progressive state, not only by measures of Muslim world, but also the entirety of Europe, circa World War I, because women had the same vote rights as men. And Naman Chilbijihan, who was like the ruler of this state, he fought for the same rights for all nations in Crimea. So it was such a progressive idea for a Muslim state in Europe. And unfortunately, Russian Empire and SSR tried to erase the whole nation, our history. And despite all these efforts, we still live today. We're still telling the world our story, our narratives, our values. And that is why I believe both Ukraine and all the countries who support us have to talk more about Crimea by the standards of Crimean Tatars, not from perspective of Russia, not from perspective of even Ukraine, I'd say, because we have our own values and our own history, and no one could tell our history better than we could.
Lina, I'm super glad that you mentioned the President Chilibjihan, because we're recording this in February. And if I'm not mistaken, around the same time in 1918, around the same days in February, he was murdered by Russians as, first president of Crimean People's Republic. And I oftentimes come back to this story because he was, as you mentioned, progressive person with such a progressive vision for Crimean People's Republic as this liberal, democratic, just society that is inclusive of Qırımli, of Ukrainians, even ethnic Russians on Crimea. But that vision, that republic, those people were brutally murdered by Russians during the 1918 invasion. And I often remember this story and think he was also 33, around the same age as most of the people our generation, fighting basically the same fight that most of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars of our generations are doing. How does it make you feel that we're going in circles over and over again, another generation facing the same challenges just because they refuse to live within the empire?
I'd say I have two words to describe my emotions. It's rage and hatred. I will not say frustration or, sadness and so on, because my feelings are very strong and maybe a little disruptive, but it is what it is. I feel kind of desperate to understand that we have 5 generations of Crimean Tatars who have no life because of Russia in all its forms. in the end of 18th century, in the times of first annexation, the peninsula by Russian Empire, almost 3/4 of Crimean Tatars left their homeland to preserve their culture because they tried just to live their lives. And they left mostly to Turkey to be closer to people who understand them, like Muslims. Then throughout next century, they had no simple life because Russia tried to persecute everyone who was inconvenient for them in Crimea. So they stole people's land. They made everything to make sure that Crimean Tatars will leave their land. Then in the beginning of 20th century, they ruined the Crimean Democratic Republic. They killed Naman Çelebi-Cihan. Then in 1928 and then in 1938, they killed all the intellectuals of our nation. The April of 17th, 1938, it's the date, Crimean Tatars call it the Black Day, because in 3 days, all the intellectual elite of Crimean Tatar nation were killed by who? By Russia. So that was the generation of my grandparents. Then my grandmother, who was Crimean Tatar, and also my granddad, who unfortunately died before my birth, they were sent to Uzbekistan because Russia wanted it. They put all the people, the whole nation, into these wagons. 1 second, sorry. Cattle wagons, yeah. And send them away from their homeland. I believe almost the half of the whole nation was murdered during that process and the first years of deportation. Then the generation of my parents who came back to Crimea mostly in 1990s, early 2000s. And even though they were at the homeland, they had, I'd say, the toughest life I could imagine for the person of generation of my parents. Because in the civilized world, when we already have internet, mobile phone, some developed infrastructure, the generation of my parents who left all their life in Uzbekistan or in some regions of Russia and Kazakhstan, they left it all to come back and to live their lives in Crimea, to be connected to their roots, to be a part of the nation, to cherish that memories. And they try to put all of these values to their children, to my generation, who's, again, because of Russia, had no chance to live our life at our homeland. So personally, me and my friends, we had to leave Crimea because of its occupation by Russia in 2014. And actually, I don't have any other feeling than hatred for Russia for doing that, because they cannot leave us alone. I mean, we're not asking for much. We are just asking to leave us alone. We can build our lives by ourselves. Okay, let me be the first generation. Let my children be the first generation of Crimean Tatars who can just simply live their lives in Crimea, to learn Crimean Tatar language, to learn how to draw ornyek, our ornament traditional, to, just to be. So, yeah, sorry, I actually forgot the question you asked.
I think you answered that and more. This was beautiful. Thank you so much. And, this is actually obviously the first time that we're meeting and talking with each other. And I think it was so powerful just a few moments ago where you said that, our power lies in our memories, because we're not experts in history, but we're experts in knowing and remembering ourselves and our lives and understanding ourselves through our memories. And this is why we're doing this season of this podcast exactly through our memories. And so I wanted to ask you, after your beautiful memories as well that you've shared with us earlier, when was the first time, was there a specific moment that made you really want to learn more about your identity and learn more and understand more? Was there a moment in time that led you to that? Or was it always something that was building up from your childhood?
It's kind of question I ask myself every day. I believe I didn't have a certain point of my life when I realized that, wow, I'm Crimean Tatar, because from the very childhood, I tried to hide that part of my identity. And actually, it was quite a common thing for Crimean Tatar children in Crimea. I know it sounds like nonsense, but it is what it is. Crimean Tatar children were bullied, for example, for darker shade of their skin, and Russian children, and actually teachers at school used to call us some offensive names just because of our heritage. And I believe in school, it was kind of a feeling of relief for me when I realized that I do not look like a Crimean Tatar girl because I have a light skin. And actually, I didn't know Crimean Tatar language at all because my mother thought that it would be safer for me to build my identity as Ukrainian girl and not as Crimean Tatar. So she didn't teach me Crimean Tatar language. And I believe till the age of 18, I was raised knowing that I am Ukrainian and not more. And when I shared my memories about the holiday of Friendship of Nations, I found some pictures. My mom sent it to me. I was dressed as Ukrainian. We have a small class of 10 people, children, because it was experimental Ukrainian class in Crimea in the middle of 2005. And there were children dressed in Crimean Tatar costumes. I was dressed as Ukrainian. And of course, the half of my classmates were dressed in Russian costumes with this kokoshnik thing. Yeah. So I believe after the age of 18, I realized that maybe I'm not fitting into this environment because I actually don't know that much about Slavic things and traditions because, my mother tried to hide my Crimean Tatar identity in me, but also we had some traditions and personally I cherish that memories. So I was raised in between these two cultures, but I didn't identify myself to neither of them. And I believe only after I graduated from university and moved to Kyiv and started talking to Ukrainians more, I realized that they see me as Crimean Tatar. I didn't have to prove to them that I am who I am. They were like, oh, your mom is Crimean Tatar, so you are. And I was like, oh, guys, no, I don't know Crimean Tatar language. And I tried to find some answers to just not agree to them. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that I actually miss my Crimean Tatar relatives. And I realized I want to share a dinner with them and that I want to come back home, not only to Crimea, like to the place where I grew up, but also to place where I can feel the connection to my roots. The place where I'd like to find more answers to the questions I have about myself. I believe Crimea will give it to me when we deoccupied and I'll be able to come home. So I believe Ukrainians did that to me. They helped me to realize who I am truly. And also Crimean Tatar community, who I found in Kyiv, also helped me a lot when I tried to understand who I am.
That's absolutely insane that the same experiences that probably most Ukrainians also went through, battling this identity erasure, battling, sometimes feeling ashamed or not knowing even where they come from. This is something that all of us share fundamentally. And I have so much respect to your work because in the beginning you said that you often feel enraged or upset about the same stuff happening to generations and generations of our own people, and that we need to do this massive extra work just to find out who we are and where we come from. But you actually channel this into your work of explaining Crimea, of making this very cool and understandable and easy to consume stories. And I was wanting to ask you about what brings you joy, like what kind of stories and what kind of moments when you share about Crimea, what brings you joy to share with the rest of the world? And what do you feel like, apart from, history and everything, what people should definitely learn about Crimea at the moment? Something that really, really brings you pleasure to share with the rest of the world.
I have actually a memory, the story from Crimea, which happened 8 years ago. Me and my friend went for a walk in Simferopol. Just an ordinary Saturday. I have no homework in school, so I have time to have a walk with him. It was gloomy, windy, snowy, not a great weather to walk, actually. And he suggested going to Alushta. It's like the southern part of Crimea. There is Black Sea and, the softer climate. So the ticket was cheap. The trolley bus ride took about an hour to Alushta. And when we came there, it was sunny. It was definitely warmer than in Simferopol. And I felt so much joy and happiness just for the possibility of being there. I was walking in Simferopol and I had this idea and I just bought tickets, and in 1.5 hours, I was already in another city, enjoying the sea and enjoying my 17, the sweetest teenage years. And I asked myself what brought me these emotions, and I realized it's the feeling that you are still at home, even though you are in another city. I felt like Alushta, Simferopol, Jankoy, any other small village in the steppe of Crimea I have never been to. They all feel like home for me, because I can go in every part of Crimea and I can find a person who will know my relatives, because Crimean Tatars, unfortunately, are a small nation and we know each other. So I felt relieved to understand that I have home, because right now in Kyiv, I call it my second home, but actually it's kind of tough being here and not being able to see my parents, my friends, and, just to visit places from my childhood, because actually I can't remember how they look like. And maybe the second sweet memory I'd like to share, to get to know people more about Crimea, the memory of Hydrles. Hydrles is a Crimean Tatar holiday of New Year. It is celebrated in spring, and it is a huge holiday for all of us. Even for those who are not religious, it's like a traditional thing to do, the cultural event. And at the age of 14, I believe, I didn't identify myself as Crimean Tatar, but someone from my family brought me to this event. And I was fascinated. How cool is that? All these people celebrating one thing. I felt like I'm being in this huge family, all people who are being so kind to me just because I am the part of this nation. And it was fun. There was music. There was kuresh. It's like a martial art of Crimean Tatars. They cooked the delicious dishes, and actually I believe it was like the first big event related to Crimean Tatar culture I experienced. I visited in my times living in Crimea, and it was so good. It was like concentrated happiness. But after this event, I was seeing the boy, my crush at that time. He was Russian. And when he asked me, what did I do today? I was ashamed to tell him that I visited Hydrles. Even the thought that I pronounce this Tatar word, Hydrles, made me so ashamed. I remember how my cheeks got red, and I said that I spend my time with my family. So this feeling of being ashamed, this feeling of not being able to be proud of your heritage, of your family, of moments that bring you joy, it's awful. So the first memory was a good one. This memory is a contrast to that. And I'd like everyone to know how it was to feel.
Thank you so much. And before we started recording this, you said that, now talking about this is the most important thing for you from the very beginning. And so I think it's so incredible to also hear from you about your journey of understanding more about yourself. And we keep talking about the fact that, the role of the colonial empire as well, any colonial empire, is to control your mind and not just to take your land and to take your resources, but actually to make you yourself doubt yourself. And so it's so incredible to hear your story as well. And I was also going to say that I'm just super grateful for your honesty when you talk about this, because, it's easy to just start saying that, this was never a process. I was always proud and I was always this and that. But actually showing people that for you, it took such bravery to kind of fight back against what the empire told you about yourself. I think this is something that can show other people as well that it's possible to learn more about yourself, disregarding how much the empire puts into controlling you. It just shows that, the Russian colonial empire has been stealing and convincing the smartest people from all over the place to come and study there. That's how they also control what a lot of people do, right? Like for centuries, for generations. And so I think the fact that now you are fighting back against that with your background and with your story is just super important for everyone else to hear. Before we wrap up, I'm going to pass over to Maksym for a very important question for all of us. I think this one is just really good for both foreigners, of course, but also for Ukrainians to think about. So, Maksym.
Once again, thank you so much for sharing these powerful stories. When I think about Qırım and Qırımli, and also as a person who's also missing his home that is now occupied, I often return to learning more about my ancestry, learning more about my ancestors and culture and songs and literature, because I think our nations who suffered under this massive erasure, they still were able back generations ago to leave these small keys in everything, in the poetry and music and songs, that now, centuries later, we can access and fight back and resist the erasure. And I think this is such a powerful experience that many Ukrainians currently are going through. Despite that, they never managed to completely erase us, although diminished us in great size. I wanted to ask you, is it something that helped you maybe also to find home within Ukrainian identity, since in your work, in your videos, you always emphasize that you feel as Kremlin as you feel Ukrainian as well. So what is that helps you to find home in both these identities? How do you explain to yourself why you're both, not just one or either?
I believe that Ukrainian part of me is talking through me when I feel that I can relate to all Ukrainians in their fight for their freedom in the first place. Because when I first visited Ukraine, that is not Crimea, I was at Maidan Square in 2017, and I remember how hard I cried when I realized what happened here. Because in November 2013 and the beginning of 2014, I was just a regular teen who only worried how to get good grades in school and to bring some joy to your parents. And only when I left my home to start living my independent life, I started thinking about all those events, historical events, in which Ukrainians went through. So when I was at Maidan Square and I was reading these lines about what happened at each day, I understood that God, even though I was 15, I wanted to be there at that time. I felt such an urge to be the part of it, to be the part of this great nation who is not afraid to fight back to Russia, to those the second strongest country, quote unquote. Yeah, and when I realized that I feel like them, I mean, it would be my natural reaction to those events that happened in Maidan in 2013, I realized that I am the part of this political nation because I feel the way they feel. And I believe if I was older, I would come to Kyiv to stand there with all the students and people who came to Maidan after the beating of students. The other part that makes me feel Ukrainian is feeling relatable to all the things that happen to Ukrainians and all the moments I, as a girl who lived in Ukraine, experienced. All those, cultural moments, songs, our common experience watching Lesia plus Roma, a TV show after school, hiding tears after singing Ukrainian hymn at school events. Oh my God, it was so strong emotion for me, even though I wasn't raised as, a great Ukrainian citizen. It was just a natural feeling for me. And I thought that it is right to do so, to feel so. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to ask you, just as we wrap up, how should Ukrainians decolonize their view of Qırım?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I believe Ukrainians have to understand how similar their ways are with Crimean Tatars, because for several centuries we have the same enemy in all its manifestations. It's Russia. And actually, I'd like to compare decolonization process as psychotherapy, because Ukrainians have to realize some things at first and then do something about it. So, to decolonize Ukrainians' perspective on Crimea, they must firstly recognize Russia's colonial policy towards Ukraine itself, to go through this reflection, to understand all the horrible things that happened to them, and to understand that it is a part of them, and unfortunately to fight through all the myths Russia has spread about Ukraine and Crimea as well, and then to liberate themselves from them. When Ukraine realizes all these things, it has to find them in Ukraine's behavior, actually. And this includes myth about Crimea and its history and the Crimean Tatars, and of course cultural appropriation, because I cannot calmly accept it when Yevhen Klopotenko not only wrongly calls Chiberek, because Chiberek is the right way, but also he claims that Chibereks are authentic Ukrainian street food. And I understand this kind of logic, but yeah, Crimea is an integral part of Ukraine. But hey, let's not forget to emphasize which nation's culture this dish comes from. And recognizing these patterns, we'll be able to separate Ukrainians from stereotypes and some fears about Crimean Tatars, because unfortunately, I hear some things from Ukrainians. I believe it's the lack of education or just common sense of things. And thirdly, I'd say not only Ukraine, but the entire international community must rid itself of colonial behavior patterns and narratives. And the whole world should abandon its habit of glorifying Russian culture and Russia's imperial achievements. Because, sorry, but no matter how often I hear words of support for Crimean Tatars under occupation, it would be strange for me to hear them from a person holding a book by Dostoevsky in their hand.
Thank you so much. I think there's so much power in what you said, and I think this is what gives me all the time hope, because, in our mutual complicated history, a history that wasn't easy between Kremlin and Ukrainians, even the recent history, because Ukrainians were part of settler colonialism culture in Crimea and helped to spread it. We are able to talk about these things and figure out and owning them. And I think this is the beauty of modern day Ukraine for me. And that all these people from very different backgrounds, different ethnically, racially, socially, they come together and have these uneasy sometimes conversations to figure out the common future for all together. And 100% I'm sure that that future will include free Crimea, Qırım. And as we often say, we will be recording some Ukrainian Spaces episodes in Qırım sometime soon. But thank you so much for joining us and sharing all these incredibly intimate and powerful stories about what it means for you to be Qırımli and Ukrainian, and why you think that the rest of the world should learn more about Qırım as this shortcut in understanding how Russian colonialism works, how it manifests itself, and eventually why there is going to be no free Ukraine without free Qırım. So thank you for your time, and we're incredibly grateful.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me here.
One question that couldn't let us go after our interview with Lina was, how can Ukrainians decolonize their views on Qırım too? We were lucky enough to have Lina join our decolonization journey, and so we asked Lina to record us a voice note that we'll leave you with in this episode.
Russia is implementing a policy of constant Russification in Crimea. 3 languages have official status in Crimea: Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar, and Russian. But Russia is doing everything to ensure that neither Ukrainian nor Crimean Tatar culture and language have any development on the peninsula. The same applies to culture, traditions, and the preservation of memory. Keeping all of this in mind, I want to emphasize that after deoccupation and in the process of decolonization of the Ukrainian perspective on Crimea, Crimean Tatars should have the opportunity to support and develop their nation in the accordance with the articles of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They should have more rights in their homeland, be able to advocate for their own interests, and be recognized as political participants in the Ukrainian state. And Ukraine, in turn, should provide these opportunities and, in the very first place, change the existing educational systems, because that's where it all starts. The change in programs need to happen firstly within Ukraine itself, so that Ukrainians see Crimea not as an exoticized resort, but also the homeland of indigenous peoples and an integral part of independent Ukraine. Secondly, changes in programs should happen in Crimea. It's necessary to provide the opportunity to study in schools using the native languages of indigenous peoples, add new subjects that would shape the youth as conscious and active citizens. In both Ukraine and deoccupied Crimea, the education system should include more information about the history of the peninsula, emphasizing that the Crimean Tatars had their own state and they created the world's first Islamic Democratic Republic. An updated education system should introduce Ukrainians from different regions of the country to each other and create common directions for all of us as friends and brothers. And of course, Ukraine should undertake the colonization and decommunization reforms, because what do Russians do first when they enter newly occupied territories? They change toponyms. I talked about this in my very first video on YouTube. After the annexation of Crimea in 1783 and after the deportation of all Crimean Tatars in 1944, Russia almost entirely changed the toponymy in Crimea to a Soviet distaste, so that today some Russophiles argue that Crimea cannot be Crimean Tatar when all the toponyms are Russian. Yeah, we grew up in villages and on streets named after the murderers of our ancestors. The restoration of original toponyms is the first thing that Ukraine should do after deoccupation of the peninsula. However, it's clear that decolonization is not just about renaming streets and removing some monuments. It's also about understanding and realizing the importance of these actions. By going through all these steps, Ukraine will be able to talk about Crimea honestly and proudly. Unfortunately, at the moment, Crimea seems to be a weak point for Ukraine, and this is not surprising because until 2014, Ukraine itself was in a challenging position and paid very little attention to Crimea. On the other hand, our Russian quote-unquote brothers never took their eyes off the peninsula for a second. I assume that's why until 2014, the authorities in Crimea were more concerned about the threat from the Crimean Tatars than from pro-Russian movements that thrilled in Crimea during the 22 years of Ukraine's renewed independence. Being the voice of Crimea, respecting it, broadcasting and advocating for the views of the indigenous peoples to the general public, highlighting the achievements and cultural contributions of the Crimean Tatars and taking pride in its diversity, that's what I want to see from Ukraine in the international dialogue.